Well, welcome to episode 359 of 10-Minute Record Reviews, a special episode, and this is the fifth in my series of jazz label guides, this time focusing on Riverside Records. If Blue Note is perhaps the most significant of all the labels that emerged after World War II to chronicle the new art form of modern jazz, then Riverside is probably pretty squarely on the very next rung. And in its heyday, you'd put it on the same kind of tier as Verve, Columbia, Prestige, Impulse, those kinds of labels. Very, very important to the whole art form. Many Riverside releases would be on the desert island lists of serious collectors, and sales of reissues continue to be strong to this day. The story of Riverside is really the story of two enterprising young jazz collectors, Orrin Keepnews and Bill Grauer, who had met at Columbia University in the early 1940s. Like Alfred Lyon and Frank Wolf and Bob Weinstock and Les Koenig out in the West Coast, these guys were jazz fans long before they were record execs. For Grauer and Keepnews, the opportunity to start a record label kind of happened by accident, but once they did, the 10 years they spent in business together with Riverside Records gave us some of the most treasured recordings in all of jazz. In this video, I'll talk about the beginnings of Riverside Records, their first forays into modern jazz, the great years of the label, and then what happened when it all came crashing to a halt. As usual, I'll include a more technical section on what to look for in distinguishing different Riverside releases, and I'll also pay attention to their sub-label, Jazzland. And at the end, I'll offer my own thoughts about collecting the music of this short-lived but remarkable label. Before I get going, there's just a few caveats I want to offer. First of all, my Riverside collection is respectable, but it's not huge, certainly not comprehensive. So, of course, there are a whole bunch of Riverside records that I either haven't heard or I haven't certainly heard on vinyl and given my full attention. And of course, needless to say, there are thousands probably of pressings with which I have no direct, immediate experience. As well, my focus, and this is not going to be a surprise to anybody who regularly follows this channel, is on Riverside's modern jazz output between 1954 and when the label goes belly up in 1964. Don't pay much attention to their archival releases of pre-war jazz, their folk records, their comedy and spoken word records, all that's out of scope. And one last caveat is that when I get into talking about label variations and recording quality, typically I'm talking about original US releases. There are many UK issues and European issues and Japanese issues of Riverside Records and Jazzland Records, and some of those are actually really good quality. But I'm not in a position to comment very widely on those, not least because the research is not readily available on those to the extent that it is for American pressing. So that's basically where I'm going to keep my comments. In preparing this video, of course, I've relied on the work of others, and I would just mention the great work done by the people at the Jazz Discography Project, whose work is unfailingly comprehensive. I'm super grateful as ever to the London Jazz Collector for his willingness to just burrow into some of the finer detail around label variations and all kinds of other aspects of the production and packaging and marketing of vinyl label by label, and I can't recommend his site highly enough. I relied on a bunch of interviews of Orrin Keepnews conducted by various people over the years, particularly the interviews done by Mark Myers on his great blog Jazzwax. And for the seriously nerdy, I would recommend a discussion of all the corporate shenanigans that went on around the collapse of Riverside in 1964 and what happens in the immediate years following in the ownership of the label and reissues and so on, which is lovingly detailed in an article by a guy called Martin Gladue, and that is linked off the main Riverside page on Discogs. I put links to all those resources in the description below. My goal, of course, here is to synthesize this and other material in a short video. If you want chapter and verse, please do visit those sites, but of course any errors on here are mine. Let's start this conversation by talking about Orrin Keepnews, who was a New Yorker. He was born in the Bronx in 1923. Very smart kid. He wins a scholarship to go to the merit-based Lincoln School in Morningside Heights in Manhattan at 123rd in Amsterdam. Intellectually, he was way ahead of the curve at Lincoln, and that's also where he developed a taste for jazz. He graduates at age 16 and heads off to Columbia University to study English. At Columbia, he combines his interest in music and the written word by writing for a student publication called Spectator. He also quickly becomes a fixture, an underage fixture, but still a fixture, in the whole jazz scene down on 52nd Street, as well as the clubs down in Greenwich Village. By about 1942, he's regularly reviewing jazz gigs for Spectator. Of course, at this time, there was a war going on, and not having a rich father or bone spurs, it was unlikely that Keepnews was going to avoid conscription. In fact, he was keen to be involved. He joined the Air Cadets, and in 1943, he's called up to the Air Force. In the Air Force, he sees some seriously active duty. He becomes a radar operator in bombers, and he goes on a whole bunch of bombing missions over Japan in the latter stages of the war. He's demobilized in 1946, and he heads back to Columbia in his words, for the express purpose of making myself literate again, and he enrolls in a grad program in English. Back on campus, Keepnews becomes reacquainted with somebody he'd only known vaguely in their undergraduate days, a guy called Bill Grauer. Grauer was also a New Yorker. He was born the same year as Keepnews, 1923. He was the much younger brother of a guy called Ben Grauer, who was a fairly notable figure in NBC history. He was one of the very first reporters on the radio of any kind of national prominence. He goes on to have a long post-war career. He is a TV host in the 50s. He's got some association with The Tonight Show in the 60s. So his younger brother, Bill, got an early exposure to the whole recording and broadcast industry. And Bill was a huge jazz fan, just like Keepnews. His interest, however, was manifested in slightly different ways, not in reviewing gigs, but in amassing a huge record collection, and he also worked at a radio station, WKCR. Grauer had pursued a grad degree at Columbia while Keepnews was off in the Air Force, and he'd already gotten his MA. When Keepnews enrolled in grad school, however, he only stayed for a few months because very shortly he had an opportunity to jump to the publishing house Simon & Schuster on the editorial staff. Keepnews' tenure at Simon & Schuster was not particularly glorious. He's basically remembered there for having turned down Jack Kerouac's first novel, The Town and the City, which Harcourt Brace subsequently put out. But if book editing wasn't his natural calling, another opportunity would soon present itself. After getting his MA, Bill Grauer had gotten a job with a hot jazz periodical called The Record Changer. It had been started a few years earlier by a guy called Gordon Gullickson, primarily to promote research on pre-war jazz, but also as a kind of a buy and sell venue for people trading 78s. Somewhere around late 1947, Grauer buys the publication from Gullickson, and then he needs an editor, so he calls his friend Orrin Keepnews. Keepnews' job at Simon & Schuster was much more stable than working at this little jazz publication, but it didn't offer anything like the freedom, and so he agrees to jump ship and join Grauer at The Record Changer. Under Grauer, and then with Keepnews added, The Record Changer evolves into a pretty cool publication. It kept its jazz focus, but it also became kind of a progressive music magazine, which also made a real point of focusing on and bringing prominence to the black musicians who were at the heart of the whole tradition. And this impulse can be seen in some of the Record Changers cover art from the early 1950s, a decade when, for the most part, jazz was marketed to white people with images of white people as opposed to the black musicians. And it's with the Record Changer in 1948 that Keepnews scores a major interview, which is one of the first national profiles of Thelonious Monk. He conducts the interview at the apartment of Alfred Lyon, the owner of Blue Note in Manhattan, and the interview ends up being quite significant for both Monk and for Keepnews, as we'll see. The Record Changer is a fascinating publication. I put a link to the whole archive in the description below. And in addition to Grauer and Keepnews, other famous jazz names who end up writing for the publication include Nasuri Erdogan, the co-founder of Atlantic Records, future Columbia producer George Avakian, and the jazz critic Ralph J. Gleason. And it's through their work at the Record Changer that Grauer and Keepnews get their first real entry into the world of making records. In January 1951, Keepnews writes an article in the Record Changer, which takes RCA Victor Records to task, basically saying they were not very serious about the reissues of their classic catalog, and they were being taken advantage of by some fly-by-night operators. The fact these two kids had drawn attention to this issue in their magazine, plus the fact that they clearly held RCA Victor's back catalog in high esteem, caused RCA Victor's execs to reach out and say, well, actually, would you guys like to license our back catalog and conduct a reissue series? Grauer and Keepnews had never really considered becoming record execs, but here was an opportunity which basically had fallen in their laps. So the following year, in 1952, they found a record company as a subsidiary of Bill Grauer's holding company, and they named it Riverside after the name of the telephone exchange for their offices in Manhattan. The plan was not only to capitalize on RCA Victor's offer, but also to reissue a whole bunch of pre-war jazz and blues purchased from now defunct labels, which they could get at a steep discount from the rights holders. And one of the funny things about Riverside is that although they became such a major name in modern jazz in the following decade, at the beginning they weren't really about that. They were just trying to make a buck. So if you look at their catalog, really for many years, and even woven in and out of the modern jazz years, they're putting out children's records, they're putting out folk records, they're putting out spoken word records, they're putting out sound effects records, records which detail the specific sounds of certain cars. On the jazz front, one of their first forays into the reissue world was the purchase of Gennett Records' back catalog. Gennett was a goldmine of classic Chicago jazz, and it included recordings by people like Jelly Roll Morton, Louis Armstrong, King Oliver, and I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, Bix Beiderbecke. This led to a whole series of reissues, and in Grauer and Keepnews' hands, the Gennett catalog was soon joined by the catalogs of other defunct labels, labels like Paramount, Circle, and QRS. So in the first 2 years of the label, they're putting out a whole bunch of pretty dated stuff musically, pre-war hot jazz, stride piano, and so on, stuff that had previously been available only on 78. But as jazz fans, they absolutely could not ignore the boom in contemporary music that was happening in the clubs in New York in the mid 1950s. I mean, that was ground zero for the explosion of modern jazz. By the time the calendar turns to 1954, it's time to start recording some contemporary music. And the first genuinely modern releases that Riverside puts out come out in 1954. The record's put out by a piano player from Brooklyn, Randy Weston, and Riverside also issues a number of records by the guitar player Mundell Lowe. The Weston recordings came about because Bill Grauer had gone up to Music Inn, which was kind of this regular summer retreat up in Massachusetts, at kind of a jazz camp of all things. Weston's trio featured the drummer Art Blakey, and there was nothing trad about Art, who of course has a very good claim to being one of, if not the founder of hard bop. But he saved most of his pyrotechnics for the work he was doing for Blue Note and with Horace Silver with the Jazz Messengers. The stuff he did with Weston was relatively mellow, but nevertheless, that's how Riverside gets their feet wet. So as 54 turns into 55, they're starting to record some contemporary modern jazz, some hard bop, but there were still 5 Jelly Roll Morton releases for every contemporary jazz release that they put out, and they were also spending a lot of time on an extensive and growing folk catalog. Riverside's work in folk is a whole other story. It's an interesting story, but our concern here is jazz, and it's in 1955 that Riverside really does arrive as a force in modern contemporary jazz with the signing of Thelonious Monk. Keepnews and Grauer needed a marquee signing to signal their presence as a serious modern jazz label. There were some interesting rumors about Prestige Records, and in particular, the scuttlebutt was that Bob Weinstock, the owner of the label, who had signed Thelonious Monk to a multi-year deal, was a bit concerned because Monk's records weren't selling. He was quite amenable, apparently, to offloading him. Keepnews saw this as a perfect opportunity because in trying to announce themselves as a real player, they saw Prestige being a cut above them, and it would be great to poach a good talent from Prestige and, in Keepnews' words, pick a fight with them. If you recall that Keepnews had interviewed Monk a few years before, this is where this becomes relevant again. He phones him up out of the blue and is shocked to find that Monk completely remembers who he is and was very, very flattered by the portrayal in the interview and is very happy to chat with him about a deal. There was still the problem, of course, of buying out the contract, and it turned out, Keepnews was able to determine, that Prestige felt that Monk owed them $108, which they had overpaid him. And Weinstock sent Keepnews a letter to this effect. So as Keepnews tells the story, he and Grauer gave Monk the $108. Monk then walks a couple blocks over to Prestige's office, pays $108, dispenses with that contract, and then walks right back and signs a new contract with Riverside within the hour. This is the moment which really turns Riverside into a serious record label. And for Keepnews as a record producer, it's also the beginning of his apprenticeship with Monk, who had very, very high standards in terms of what he wanted to hear. He gave Keepnews all kinds of guidance, and together they made a whole string of excellent records, arguably the very best records that Monk made in his whole career. Monk benefits from this whole arrangement too. Of course, he was still kind of in exile. He had his cabaret card, which allowed you to perform in the 5 boroughs of New York, taken away in the early 50s over a drug case involving Bud Powell. He was able to gig in Brooklyn, kind of under the radar, thanks to Randy Weston. But with his signing and Riverside then doing what they could to help him get his cabaret card back, this begins a period in which Monk's legend is basically confirmed and Riverside becomes one of the biggest labels in jazz. Of course, having signed Monk, Keepnews was well aware that not only had Monk struggled to sell records at Prestige, his track record at Blue Note prior to that had not been much better either, regardless of the quality of the music. So Keepnews asked Monk, first of all, to record a couple of records of standards which he thinks are going to sell. And the first of those is a collection of Ellington covers, and the second is a collection of standards called the Unique Thelonious Monk. And there's a funny parallel here because some years later, when John Coltrane first signs to Impulse, Bob Thiele strikes an almost identical deal with Coltrane, which is, look, you can play your crazy Coltrane music all you want, but first of all, would you please, to keep the suits happy, record some very accessible records? So Coltrane, of course, makes his record with Johnny Hartman, he makes his ballads record, and he makes a collaboration record with Duke Ellington. So here Duke is the pathway to respectability for Monk earlier on and Coltrane later. Those records did okay, although, again, they didn't have Monk's own original compositions, which, of course, is his special sauce, so the best was yet to come. In 1955, Riverside also puts out other modern jazz releases. There's stuff by Kenny Drew, stuff by the now largely forgotten but excellent Ernie Henry. But again, this was really just the beginning. If the signing of Monk in 1955 was a statement of intent, the year that Riverside really lifts off in terms of putting out a large volume of very high quality modern jazz, that year was 1957. And coincidentally or not, that's also the year that Monk really starts to push out a whole bunch of original material. That year sees the release of 4 great Monk records, really classic Monk. Brilliant Corners, which is just terrific. Thelonious himself, a solo outing. You can't really see the full title because of the irritating Obi strip, because I have a Japanese copy. Monk's Music, with the tremendous version of Abide With Me on here and several other just classic Monk tracks. And a record I reviewed just the other day, Mulligan Meets Monk. It also includes a release of LPs by Bill Evans, his debut New Jazz Conceptions, 2 fantastic records by the trumpeter Kenny Dorham, including a great joint effort with Ernie Henry, and a very nice record from Sonny Rollins, The Sound of Sonny. Following year in 1958, Grauer and Keepnews managed to sign Cannonball Adderley, who had made such a splash when he arrived in New York in the mid-50s. He'd recorded up until that point with Mercury Records subsidiary Emercy. They also signed Chet Baker. Now, signing Chet Baker is usually a double-edged sword historically because of his lifestyle issues, which means recording him is usually a case of carpe diem. However, it's very hard to argue with the quality of records like Chet Baker in New York or Chet Baker Sings. Both of these are craft reissues, hence the fabulous glossy covers. And of course, the eponymous Chet. Great record. And so if you think about it, the change in just a couple of years in Riverside's output is stark. In 1956, their high-quality contemporary releases were islands in a sea of pre-war jazz, folk, comedy, and novelty records. But the star power and momentum is increasing leaps and bounds in the late 50s through people like Monk and Cannonball. Monk, in particular, was flourishing. In 1957, he was back performing in Manhattan again with those legendary dates at the 5 Spot with Coltrane and then with another band in early 58. This period sees some of his greatest recordings, including those great solo records, Thelonious himself, and this one, a real favorite of mine, Thelonious Alone in San Francisco. And so by 1959, high-powered releases by Riverside were the rule rather than the exception. 1959 also sees the arrival of arguably the last superstar to join Riverside alongside Cannonball, Baker, Evans, and Monk, a guitar player from Indianapolis called Wes Montgomery. 59, as everyone knows, is an amazing year for jazz, and that's in part because of the incredible output on Riverside that year. It includes Montgomery's debut, A Dynamic New Sound, 4 records by the Adderley Brothers, 2 records by Chet Baker, 2 records by Monk, 2 records by Horace Silver's fantastic trumpet player, Blue Mitchell, as well as records by Benny Golson, Johnny Griffin, Wynton Kelly, Abbey Lincoln, Bill Evans, Billy Taylor, and Philly Joe Jones. So by 1960, things are going great guns at Riverside, and that year they start a secondary label, jazz label, called Jazzland. At first, Jazzland is basically a vehicle to do some stereo reissues of earlier mono material, but soon enough it becomes a vehicle for original recordings, and there isn't really much rhyme or reason as to why something would be a Jazzland release as opposed to a Riverside release. I'm sure they had some rationale, but in retrospect, it's not really self-evident. Could well have just been a marketing exercise, but in any event, the quality of jazz that Riverside and Jazzland put out through 1960, 61, 62 is really right up there with the quality of jazz that anybody in the recording world was putting out in those years. They also branched out more and more into live recordings and produced some of the best ever live jazz recordings that you can find on record, including, of course, those famous sessions at the Village Vanguard by Bill Evans and his trio and the ill-fated Scott LaFaro. These, of course, if you're not aware of this, the Village Vanguard session and Waltz for Debbie are actually all taken from the same sessions in 1961. So Riverside is going from strength to strength to strength in this era. Their releases stack up with anybody's releases from that period. But despite all this brilliance, this success was going to be short-lived. In December 1963, Bill Grauer dies suddenly of a heart attack at the age of 40. And despite all of its success, Riverside goes bankrupt just 6 months later. How could this happen? The story essentially has to do with some sloppy accounting, not unknown in the record business, Riverside produced way too many individual titles for a small label, and its business practices were pretty sloppy. They'd release records in mono and stereo in large numbers, distribute them proactively without getting the orders in advance. They also produced a ridiculous number of novelty records. I mentioned the ones about all the recordings of sports cars. By the time that Grauer died, they had been in the practice of pushing out enormous amounts of stock, and they end up with all kinds of records being returned by dealers. And parenthetically, if you have records in your collection with corners cut out or punch holes, those are records which have been returned by dealers because they didn't sell back in the day. They'd been using the raw numbers of how many records they'd shipped to get credit with the bank, representing these as sales, but of course they weren't sales. The bank eventually figures this out and forecloses, and in the summer of 1964, Riverside goes belly up. The whole house of cards collapses, although Keepnews does retain the rights to the catalog, which by that point, of course, included the rights to some of the greatest records in jazz history. Keepnews himself moves on. Originally, he goes to Colpix Records in 1964, and then, a little later, in 1966, with a friend of his, a piano player called Dick Katz, he forms Milestone Records. But the recording at Riverside basically comes to a hard stop in early 1964. So from that point on, Riverside ceases to be a vital force in jazz, and really its story then is associated to subsequent reissues and who's owning the reissues and the quality of those reissues and so on. It basically stopped making any new music in 1964. After the bankruptcy, initially the reissues were done by a company called Orpheum, which was set up by the same bank that had foreclosed, primarily to try and get some kind of return from the dealers who held all this stock, but also to put out some records they figured would sell and bring some income in. The Orpheum arrangement lasts for a couple of years, but eventually Howard Stark and Bob Thiel of ABC Records and also of Impulse Records move in, and they license the rights to the Riverside back catalog from Keepnews, and ABC has the rights between 1967 and 1972. ABC reissues a lot of the classic Riverside titles in that period, and then in 1972, Fantasy Records, flush with all this cash they'd made from having Creedence Clearwater Revival on their roster of artists in the late 60s and early 70s, buys the Riverside catalog outright from Orrin Keepnews. Keepnews then joins the company, so he's back associated with his old catalog, and he's able to entice Bill Evans to come to Fantasy 2. And this is a period of renaissance for Fantasy Records. And in this period of renaissance, not only are they putting out great records by Bill Evans, but Keepnews is also able to do some carefully controlled reissues of the old Riverside material. As a consequence, Fantasy's reissues in the 70s are more comprehensive and typically of higher quality than the ones done by ABC in the late 60s and early 70s. And then after Keepnews leaves Fantasy in 1980, Fantasy then embarks on the now, I guess, famous amongst collectors, Original Jazz Classics series of releases, which were very high quality from the original tapes, and that represents probably the largest single mass of high quality reissues of Riverside material that's available on the market. So if you have a very nice early 1980s OJC issue of a Bill Evans record on Riverside, you can thank John Fogerty for that. And these days, if you're keeping track, for what it's worth, Riverside's catalog is owned by an outfit called Concord Records, who in turn are owned by Village Roadshow Pictures. If you're just dipping into Riverside's overall catalog, it can be kind of confusing. There's a somewhat partial discography which you can find on Wikipedia, which really only lists the modern jazz releases, which of course is largely what we're concerned with. I'm not quite sure how comprehensive that is, but if you're interested in collecting Riverside's great jazz releases between 1955 and 1964, here are what I think are the basics of what you need to know. First of all, in terms of parsing out the different labels that are associated with Riverside, Riverside had a whole bunch of sub-imprints like Judson Records, Washington Records, Battle Records, but those are all different genres. The only ones that you really need to focus on for modern jazz are Riverside Records and Jazzland Records. The Riverside imprint starts to appear in 1953 thereabouts. Jazzland isn't created until 1960, but as I mentioned, Riverside doesn't really get into the modern jazz game until 1954 and then properly in 1955. I mentioned that Riverside's catalog has a whole bunch of pre-war jazz and folk and comedy, spoken word, sound effects, sports cars, you name it. And generally speaking, you can filter all the rest of this stuff out just by focusing on the catalog numbers. Riverside's mono series catalog numbers typically start, here's an example from, this is Mysterioso, an early pressing of this. This typically starts with RLP for Riverside LP. And then in the early days, for the first 30 or 40 releases, I think it is, or maybe a bit more than that, 12 to indicate it's a 12-inch record, and then a 3-digit number, in this case, 279. And if you're a modern jazz collector, the 3 series that you want are the 200 series, the 300 series, and the 400 series. Later on in these series, as we get into the later 50s, stereo starts to make an appearance, and there Riverside indicates stereo by adding a 9 in front. So this would have been, the mono release would have been 444, but they added 9 in front of it. So this is a Cannibal Adderley record, Jazz Workshop Revisited. So anyway, they would typically put a 9, not all the time, but some of the time, in front of the mono number to indicate that it was stereo. Although I personally don't have a big enough Riverside collection to speak definitively on this, relying on what other people have to say, it appears that mono is strongly preferred to stereo in early Riverside releases. One of the things that happened with stereo in the early days, that people got really excited about the different things stereo could do, and they exploited it to the maximum. So you would have horns panned all the way over to one side of the stereo spectrum, and you might have the drums or what have you on the other side. It gets a bit taxing to listen to that, and so mono is typically a better way to go. Anyway, as I mentioned, the 200 series, the 300 series, and the 400 series are really the Riverside series that you want to be gathering. Just for reference, the 100 series was some of their old archival stuff, things like Ma Rainey and Jelly Roll Morton. The 600 series is folk music. The 800 series is a mix of folk and cabaret and comedy. The 1100 series is largely stereo reissues of things which were previously put out in mono. I've read that Riverside did not do that electronic reprocessing of mono to make it stereo, but I'm not really sure, being not very technically astute, how you release a stereo version of a record that was recorded as a mono record. So I tend not to avoid necessarily, but to be cautious around stereo reissues of earlier mono records. When it comes to the actual physical labels on the records and the progression of those labels, and this is something that other people, and I've linked to some of these people in the description, have spent a lot of time researching and thinking about. But here are the basics, and this is all largely to do with original releases, but you can use this information, if you're clever about it, to date reissues as well. All original era releases, by which I mean everything leading up to the 1964 bankruptcy, have the classic Riverside logo of the 2 reels and the microphone. If the label has a deep groove running through it, that is usually an indication that this is a pressing from the original era. The absence of deep groove does not necessarily mean that it is not an original era pressing, because of course Riverside used a variety of different pressing plants, and deep groove itself disappears slowly from the industry between 1961 and 1964. The last original Riverside release with a deep groove is RLP 420, The Carry Dancers by Johnny Griffin, but there are earlier examples prior to that of original era records without a deep groove. When it comes to the color scheme of the labels, the earliest modern jazz releases from about 200 to 240 have a white label with either a pale gray or a pastel blue secondary color. In 1957, Riverside then switches from white labels to bright blue labels, but strangely, there then follows a phase where they have different sizes of labels. So-called large blue labels, which are 100 millimeters across, the same size as the labels on pretty much all your other records, last from release 243 to around 270, 280, somewhere in there. And then a smaller label, which is only 92 millimeters across, takes over. Why was this? Well, Riverside was using something called the groove guard technique, which was a way of pressing vinyl where the center part of the record, the bit that the label sits on, was slightly elevated. And the reason for this was if you were stacking records in a record changer, which of course we would never dream of doing now, but we all used to do back in the day, the thicker part of the central part of the record kept the bit with the information on, the grooves, from rubbing against the groove area of other records. So this was a way of protecting your records if they were stacked up in a record changer. So here's an example of a small label, and this is Kenny Drew's record, Pal Joey, and you should be able to see that the deep groove cuts through the microphone and the reels of the logo on the label. If this were a large label, the deep groove would go below the logo. And here is an example of a large label. This is a James Clay record, and you should be able to see that here the deep groove does not cut through the microphone and the reels, but goes slightly below them, and that's basically the way to tell. Anyway, the small labels are used until release number 333 in 1960, after which time they go back to large labels. And at the same time, for all releases from 334 on, you will see the abbreviation Inc. for Incorporated after Bill Grauer Productions on the label. So that's the basic story of Riverside during the classic original period when the label was in existence. Once it goes bust, then you start to get real variability in labels. There are a very small number of plain label issues, a blue label without any logo whatsoever, which are put out very shortly after the company goes bust, probably by the holding company of the bank that had foreclosed. But then Orpheum was created as a company by that bank as a vehicle for, again, recouping some of the funds from all the stock that was out there with dealers, but also for putting out new reissues as well. The Orpheum reissues actually sound pretty good. You can tell them quite easily because, first of all, they've got no logo, and secondly, as you can probably see at the bottom, it says very clearly Orpheum Productions in the lower rim of the label. When ABC Records takes over in 1967, you end up with something which looks an awful lot like the Impulse Records logo, which of course ABC also put out. This is a Japanese press of a West Montgomery record, and you can see that the color scheme is very, very similar to Impulse Records, and they've also got a new logo, this kind of funky looking R. And then when we get to the Fantasy Records era from 1972 on, and then of course in particular the original Jazz Classics releases from the 1980s, we see a return to the classic livery, albeit with slight variations in color. So here is a Montgomery Brothers release, although ironically, of course, it would never have come up with that label color originally. It would have been an electric blue label, but that is essentially the original color scheme of Riverside Records. But of course, from the Fantasy and OJC eras, there are lots of other clues that these are later pressings. In particular, there's the text around, describing Fantasy Records at the bottom, and there is a whole series of font choices which are much more 1984 and not so much 1959. And Fantasy Records, as I say, was pretty good about sticking to that original livery. There are some anomalies, however. This is my OJC copy of Sonny Rollins' Freedom Suite, which has a black label, which was typically reserved, upside down, which was typically reserved for stereo releases, although this is not a stereo pressing, so I don't quite know what's up with that, but maybe somebody just decided to get funky with it. Now, I said I'd say a few things about the Jazzland label, which of course has a run originally from 1960 to 1963. There are just shy of 100 titles on the Jazzland imprint, but only 78 of those are actually new recordings of original material. The rest is a reissue exercise of old Riverside records. The color scheme is pretty simple. If it's an orange label, it's mono. If it's a black label, it's stereo. If it's a promotional copy, it's a white label. Here's my copy of Harold Land's West Coast Blues. Somebody was a bit rough with it, so someone's got some hockey tape or something at the bottom. So the naming convention is not too surprising. So there you see JLP for Jazzland LP. This is a 20th release in the series. You can tell that it's a mono pressing because there we are, because it is an orange label. And for stereo releases, again, you had the 9 prefix and sometimes an S suffix in the catalog number. Jazzland also had the large and small label thing. In the original release sequence, small labels are there from the very beginning through about the first 25 releases. I think this, in theory, should be a small label based on when it was released. I should just check. Yeah, so this is a small label, and if you look very carefully, you can see, there you are, that raised groove guard thing in the center, which was supposed to keep the record safe when you were otherwise treating it poorly. And then after that point, after the first 25 releases, they go back to the large labels again. Most of the original Jazzland releases have the deep groove in the label, but again, that starts to diminish after about 1962. So when you're collecting Riverside records or Jazzland records, when it comes to pressing quality, original run Riversides are not as predictably excellent as either Blue Note or Contemporary. The quality control sometimes took a backseat to the bottom line. All that said, I would still say that the rule of thumb about early pressings are best still applies here. If sound quality really matters to you, then I think you have two choices. A, looking for vintage pressings of Riverside or Jazzland records, or B, investing in some of those new all analog reissues done by Kevin Gray at Kraft. Sure, they're expensive, but typically speaking, they're way less expensive than looking for an original in good shape. Otherwise, if you come across a Riverside or a Jazzland release in the wild, here is the hierarchy of choices I would suggest if you're not in the market for pre 1964 releases, that is. First of all, I would snap up any mid 1980s OJC reissues, which are typically of a very high standard, normally being made from the original tapes. I'd also be quite motivated to pick up an Orpheum reissue from 1965 and 1966. You probably won't go far wrong picking up one of the fantasy reissues from 1972 on, the ones that were associated with Orrin Keepnews coming to the company. While, of course, there will be anomalies all the way through the reissue catalog, the only area where you really should be careful is that 1967 to 72 ABC Records period. As I mentioned before, err on the side of mono if you have a choice. I should note, too, although I focus very much on American pressings here, that some people are of the view, and I have a couple of records like this in particular. I've got my copy of Thelonious Monk at the Blackhawk, that some people are of the view that European UK pressings done in the 1960s by Interdisc. Here's an example. I'll just show you the label so you know what to look for. Um, it looks similar to, but not identical to, the original Riverside livery. You can see there's the logo, and again that very classic box that Riverside used. But the deep groove is not there. It's instead this big indentation, and this is very typical of UK pressings. This is done by Interdisc. That's one example. I'll show you a second from a little later in the 60s. Here's my copy of Cannonball Adderley Quintet in San Francisco, and here again there's the blue scheme, but this is a European pressing, and you'll see again there's no deep groove. This is from later on in the 1960s. Anyway, both of these sound great, and if you listen to the London Jazz Collector, he is of the view, he has a lot of these European pressings, and he thinks they sound pretty good. And as he says, one of the rare occasions where it may be better to pick up a European pressing than an original US pressing. Anyway, I don't have enough data to know how true that is, but certainly I have no complaints about the sound quality of those two records. What's not up for debate here is the quality of the music. Riverside might not have the largest catalog, but it has some of the finest music which was ever committed to vinyl in the classic era of modern jazz, including what might be claimed as the career highs of people like Bill Evans and Thelonious Monk, Cannonball Adderley, and Wes Montgomery. And if you haven't explored this music, well, there's no time like the present. Hope you enjoyed this video. Happy collecting, and we'll see you next time.